So to set the context for their presentations, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is online with us via Skype, he will talk to us about the importance of clean energy for sustainable development. He is a world-renowned professor of economics, a leader in sustainable development, a senior advisor to the United Nations, a best-selling author, and a syndicated columnist. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sachs to our screen. All right. All right.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Afternoon. Oops. I think if you turn down the mic, that'll be better. Your microphone on the computer, possibly. Okay, let's do this. I think this will work. It's fine with me. I just turned it down on my side. So let me thank you for this boot camp, first of all, which is a fantastic idea and very important. And thank you for including me. I am an economist, and I am working on the public policy of sustainable development. I'm the special advisor to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on sustainable development, and that includes the fight against global warming. So in September 2015, all 193 UN member countries adopted the framework of sustainable development, and specifically 17 sustainable development goals that range from ending poverty, fighting hunger, promoting universal coverage of healthcare, to the environmental objectives. And the 13th of the 17 is to stop human-induced climate change. And there was an asterisk in adopting those goals that say we will guarantee global diplomatic support for what comes out of the negotiations that will take place in Paris back in December 2015, a few weeks after adopting this sustainable development framework. And as you know, in Paris on December 12, the same 193 governments adopted the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's kind of our last chance on climate safety, because we're just in a blowout right now where, because of inaction, ever since the signing of the Framework Convention on Climate Change way back in 1992 at the Earth Summit, we're already basically at the very end of our capacity to achieve climate safety. The Earth has warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level. We have a lot of further warming already built into the Earth's systems, but we're just with the imbalance of the ocean still warming. So because of thermal inertia, there are still some tenths of a percent of 1 degree C that are built in to the current levels of greenhouse gas concentrations. And if we're going to achieve even a modicum of climate safety, and especially to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, we have to radically decarbonize the world's energy system within the next 30 years. So my colleagues, the climatologists, tell me that when Earth was even slightly warmer than it is right now, maybe even just a half a degree warmer, the last time that that was true was the previous interglacial period, the Eemian period, which was 115,000 years ago. And the bad news is that during the Eemian, the sea levels were about 6 to 8 meters higher than they are today. So we're just at the on the edge of already putting in motion perhaps an irreversible loss of parts of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Now, therefore, this is no joke, even though our government treats it as such right now. We are basically at the very end of our capacity to stay, in the words of the Paris Climate Agreement, well below 2 degrees C. That's the target of Paris, well below 2 degrees C, with the aim to stay below 1.5 degrees C, which is almost surely out of reach right now, except possibly with overshooting and then return. We probably could stay below 1.7 or 1.8 degrees C, all relative to the pre-industrial. But that would require living within an extremely tight carbon budget if we want to have a high likelihood of success. And as I'm sure most or all of you know well, to stay at 1.7 or 1.8 degrees C relative to pre-industrial, we have perhaps 800 billion tons of CO2 emission remaining. And we're emitting between 35 and 40 billion tons a year right now. So we have well under a quarter century remaining of a carbon budget at our current emissions rates. And that means, as every climatologist will tell us, that we have to be on a path of radical decarbonization between now and mid-century and reach something like zero by 2050, and perhaps through biological and geological storage of CO2, go negative in the second half of the 21st century. So this is a phenomenal challenge. We've never engineered a global transition of the energy system in this kind of stark way before. We have a market economy which generally has guided the energy transition since James Watt's steam engine back in 1776. And the world economy evolved mainly through market forces and, of course, government infrastructure over more than 200 years, about 250 years, as a fossil fuel-based economy. And now we have to decarbonize in a matter of 30 to 35 years. It's an unprecedented challenge. It's unprecedented because it would require the best of engineering and the best of global cooperation to achieve success, but we also have to do it in the face of relentless opposition from the coal, oil, and gas industry. And of course, in our country, we are almost a petrostate and have been for 100 years, where the power of coal, oil, and gas has been, for the last century, really perhaps the most powerful single lobby in the United States. And that lobby still owns the Republican Party. And it owns it in no small part through the handiwork of two brothers, David and Charles Koch, who between them have $100 billion invested in oil and gas, basically. Or their net worth, I should say, is through the investment in oil and gas. And they're fighting a rearguard action which is as ugly and corrupt as can be. And that's why President Trump was sent a letter by 22 congressional leaders in the week before Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I emphasize all of this because it sometimes looks like the president's just a dingbat, which he is, but it's more than just the foolishness. It's actually a very powerful lobby. Now, this comes to you, and I'm absolutely delighted that you are the young cutting edge of technology on giving options. The fact is, and I really want to say this very clearly, despite the rearguard politics of this process, despite a president who would say anything and tell any lie on almost anything, by the way, we are actually on a path of decarbonization. And though the Trump administration tried to break the Paris Climate Agreement this past spring, in advance of the G20 meeting in Hamburg, Germany, they went around diplomatically trying to tell the Russians, hey, come with us, or the Saudis, come with us, the Turks, come with us. No other country broke. And so at the G20 in Hamburg, Germany in July, 19 of the 20 countries said the Paris Climate Agreement is non-negotiable, and we stick strongly with it. The United States stood out in its foolishness by itself, but even the United States will come back because almost everybody knows better. It's just the corruption that got us to the current mess, but the corruption's going to be overcome also. So that comes to you and the following challenge. And that is, how should the U.S. and other major emitting countries decarbonize the energy system? This is an analytical question that involves complex decision-making of a very complex energy system over many dimensions and a high level of uncertainty and a time horizon, as I said, of 30 to 50 years. And that kind of analytical work is underway now, thank goodness, with increasing frequency. I've been leading teams on looking at deep decarbonization pathways to mid-century for the main emitting countries of the world. And you can actually look up online, because I think they're interesting, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, to look at some of these scenarios that are looking at a macro level at how the energy system can be transformed. And all of these scenarios have essentially the basic point that we need energy efficiency, we need zero carbon electricity, and we need to switch from the internal combustion engine and boilers and furnaces to electricity or electricity produced clean fuels like hydrogen. So the transformation, the deep decarbonization path, is a path of energy efficiency, zero carbon power generation, and what we call fuel switching, mainly going to electrification of vehicles and home heating and cooling, or to the use of hydrogen through hydrolysis for similar purposes, for fuel cell vehicles rather than electric battery vehicles. But all of the country pathways are similar. And I think the burning question, if I could call it that, is how to get to zero carbon power on a large, reliable scale. And as, of course, you know well, you're in the middle of it, that's a pretty fierce debate. What can be done on the basis of renewables, wind, solar, new storage ideas, pumped hydro or other kinds of reservoirs, or other kinds of storage, for instance, direct transformation of wind and solar into synthetic fuels through carbon capture and reuse? And to what extent should we be exploring a large and growing role for nuclear? And to what extent should we be exploring carbon capture and geologic storage? And there are huge proponents of all of those pathways, and they fight pretty bitterly. And generally, that means that all of these different pathways have a lot of merit. And of course, the ultimate shares of different methods of power generation, different methods of different fuel carriers will depend a lot on how technologies unfold and a lot on public policy. If you go to Germany these days and talk about nuclear energy, you're absolutely just booed off the stage. They don't want to hear a word about it. If you go to China or Korea or India, of course, it's a central part of the mix, and with many, many plants under construction right now. In the United States, it's highly contested turf. And part of the problem is we've not had the young entrepreneurial crowd like you are for a long time saying, hey, there are really, really important, interesting, safe, new technologies, small modular reactors or different fuel cycles that can address the challenges of safety, proliferation risk, and so forth. And now there is a tremendous excitement about new ways of approaching nuclear power generation. So I'll come to a close here. I am a consumer of what you're doing, an urgent, eager consumer of the results of your work and deliberation. My job is to advise the United Nations and to talk about what options are, what kind of global cooperation is needed. I am convinced myself from my discussions with many, many colleagues around the world that there is an important, inevitable role of nuclear energy in the global decarbonization. I am an avid consumer of different models, pathways, economic estimates that debate which role in which places and which kinds of technologies are likely to unfold. But I believe that the next few years will play a really decisive role in these choices, partly because we're running out of time. We're going to have to take some pretty strong decisions. And part of that will be what kinds of technologies are available, what novel pathways, to what extent should nuclear serve the role of power generation, to what extent should it play a direct role and a different role, for example, through direct desalination or direct community heating or hydrogen production or other possible uses as well, of which there are many proposed pathways. And how do we create a public policy environment in which the public is well informed, in which debates are taking place on a well-informed, evidence-based, rational, and considering the range of options. I mean, maybe we've lost the White House for a few years, but the more general public would actually still like an evidence-based discussion. And therefore, the kinds of work and brainstorming that you're engaged in at the boot camp is really essential. This fall, I will be continuing to host a number of gatherings at the United Nations on deep decarbonization pathways. And I will, for one, be extraordinarily eager to hear what you have come up with in these 10 days of intensive deliberations that I understand you have underway. So thank you for letting me join you. It's a pleasure, and I really look forward to learning from you. Thanks a lot.